All right, so we have the kettle rolling on this brew day for our IPA called Sabo. And as always, what we're trying to do is we're trying to pack as much flavor and aroma as we can into our hop forward beers. So throughout the day, we've been talking about how we're trying to accomplish that. We talked about what we're doing with the grain bill. We've talked about what we're doing with the water profile. And now we're gonna get into some of the ingredients and techniques, okay? The next process difference in making a beer like this for us is to lower the temperature of the whirlpool, all right? Now, some of this might be, for those of you that are not used to the brewing process, stick with me and we'll try to explain this through. One of the things that hops does for a beer is it contributes bitterness. The longer you boil a hop, the greater capacity there is for generating bitterness in a beer, the more bitterness it's going to create. And that is related to temperature. So if I boil a hop for 60 minutes as opposed to 30 minutes, I will generate more bitterness in the beer with the 60-minute addition as opposed to the 30-minute addition. What we're trying to do and what's trying to be accomplished with some of these newer school hopping procedures is we're trying to get as much hop flavor and aroma compounds as possible into a beer and generate just enough bitterness for that beer to be balanced. So what we have to do is we have to manipulate ways. Hey Joe.
Hi Adam.
We have to manipulate our process so where we can get as much of these hop compounds into solution, okay, without generating as much bitterness. One of the ways is by dropping the temperature of your whirlpool or the kettle. What we would normally do is we would normally just turn off the steam on the kettle. The beer would hover around 210, 212 degrees for the entire time before we start cooling the wort, sending it to the fermenter. And it would continue to generate bitterness based on the volume of hops that we have in the kettle at that point. What we're gonna do today though is we're gonna lower the temperature of the kettle. And when you lower the temperature of the kettle down to 170 where we're going today, you generate less bitterness, okay? So what this means is I can add a lot more hops to the whirlpool and create less bitterness than I normally would. If I turn the steam off on the kettle and the kettle is 212 degrees and I whirlpool it and I throw in enough hops to create 10 bittering units, okay, that's how bitterness is measured. If I lower the temperature of that kettle to like 170, 175, 180 or around in there, I can throw twice as many hops in there and achieve the same amount of bitterness, okay? Because the ability to generate bitterness diminishes as you cool down the kettle. So what I'm leveraging that to do is I'm cooling the kettle so I can throw even more hops in, which will allow me to get more hop flavor and aroma into the beer going into the fermenter. That's what I'm doing with the whirlpool. I'm lowering the whirlpool so I generate less bitterness, but hopefully a lot more flavor and aroma because I can add more hops to that process. Second part of this is an ingredient thing. I'm using specific hops that are known to have their hop flavor that is infused in the whirlpool carry over into the finished beer, okay? Those hops are Citra, Mosaic, and Idaho 7. I'm using all three of these in the whirlpool here. I'm using 11 pounds each of Citra and Mosaic. Both of those beers, both those hops are in cryo form, meaning it's a concentrated form of the pellet that has less green matter in it. Citra, Mosaic, and Idaho are known to be high in compounds that are known as survivables. It's the idea that those particular hops have hop compounds that will last from the whirlpool all the way into the finished beer. One of the descriptions that I heard is we talked about boiling and boiling off flavors and aromas. If you're boiling something, you can smell it in the air, you're losing it in the finished beer. I think it's Jeremy Marshall from Lagunitas. I was listening to an interview with him, and I think it was him that said that he kind of thinks about fermentation as the second boil, meaning it's the second time where you're pushing volatiles out of solution, okay? So sometimes you can smell that CO2 that's blowing off of an IPA fermentation and it'll smell hoppy, right? These 3 hops that I'm using are notoriously high in compounds that will survive that process and last into the finished beer, and that's what we're really aiming for. So I'm really slamming this thing with the best hops that I really can, right? And I'm pretty excited about it. One other thing that we did, one other component change that we made here is I did add some kosher salt to the kettle, just some NaCl. The reason I didn't add, I'm doing that to add more chloride to it, to get my chloride numbers up closer to 250 in the finished beer. The reason I did that is because I didn't want to keep using calcium chloride, because that will keep adding more and more calcium. And if I add more and more calcium, I can get to a point to where this beer will want to drop clear, and I don't want it to do that. I want some of that haze particulate, some of that protein particulate up, and polyphenol particulate, but I want it up in solution, because that's one of the carriers for hop flavor and aroma when you approach a beer from this standpoint. But anyway, so the addition of just plain kosher salt, non-iodized, nothing like that. You don't want to be throwing an iodized product into your kettle. I'm throwing that kosher salt in because that will drive up my chloride number, and also obviously a little bit of sodium as well can help to round out a beer as well.